Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Today is the detailed overview of the Superpowers revision unit over here on my channel. If you haven't seen me before, I'm Lara. I am currently in my third year of uni and I'm hopefully, well, next year I am training to be a geography teacher. I'm making these series because one, you've asked for it, and two, I originally started making them because during my A-levels I thought this would be so super useful for myself, and so I wanted to make it for you guys. Once I had a bit more subject knowledge to be able to combine these things and share them with you well. So I hope you find this useful. I'm just going to get straight on into this because it's a big topic. Strap yourselves in for like 40-45 minutes and let's get going. Superpower theory. A superpower is a nation which has the ability to project its influence onto the world. This global influence means they have a say in decision making, and they are often forces for change. The four pillars of superpower status are economic, military, political ideology and cultural. So economic. A large economy enables a nation to control trade. They also use their money to invest in a strong military force and exploit natural resources. They may also own the debt of other nations, thereby having power over them. Secondly, military. A nation can use their military to threaten or invade other countries, which is a hard power, or to achieve geopolitical goals, such as UN peacekeeping missions. Political and ideology. The ability to influence other countries is closely linked with politics, as many states may force their ideology through cultural policies. And fourthly, cultural. Projecting a nation's cultural values onto others can change the way other populations think and align their ideology with the superpower's culture. Culture is often spread through social media, films, music, art and food. The westernization of culture is an important aspect of power. Another factor which a nation can use to exercise their superpower status is resources. Physical resources like oil and gas, if a nation has the means to exploit them, can help a nation to develop their economy, and therefore means their economic power through trade. If these countries are dependent on the superpower for their natural resources, then the superpower will have power over them, such as Russia providing gas to Europe. And then human resources. A large human workforce, if utilised properly, can help to develop a nation's economy. For example, the emerging superpowers of China and India both have large populations, which are being used in manufacturing to develop their economies. Many would consider a global superpower as the USA, closely followed by the EU. However, this hasn't always been the case. There are many theories and ideas trying to explain why different powers have different powers at different times. The power spectrum. The power spectrum describes the different approaches countries may have in influencing their power or culture on another. The power spectrum goes from hard to soft power. Hard power examples: using military and direct political intervention to change or influence the behaviour of other countries, such as military action, threat of trade restrictions such as embargoes, the use of economic sanctions to damage a nation's economy, and owning debt of other countries. And then soft power is attracting national governments and individuals to their country through attractive culture and lifestyle, sought after political advice, foreign policies that encourage migration, trade alliances, foreign direct investment in business, infrastructure or facilities. Mackinder's geostrategic location theory. The British geographer Mackinder classified regions of the Eurasia as the heartland. This area stretches from Russia to China and from the Arctic to the Himalayas. He argued that the heartland was a geostrategic location because whoever controlled it would control the amount of physical and human resources. The theory was influential because it contributed to policies of containment. After World War I, attempts were made to limit Germany's expansion into the strategic area, and after World War II, NATO allies tried to contain the Soviets from expanding into the south and west of Europe. However, as technology has advanced and made transportation easier, the shrinking world has reduced the locational importance of the heartland. Resources can be easily transported all around the world. Advances in military technology means that armies have a much more of a global influence without the need to colonise other nations. This has allowed nations such as America, which is on the exterior of the heartland, to take over the stage as the global superpower. Wallerstein's World Systems Theory. The World Systems Theory identifies two economic areas within the world, the core and the periphery. Core regions are economic powerhouses and therefore control most of the global trade, such as trade agreements and trading currency. The core regions are those in the periphery. The core regions trade with those in the periphery, who often provide labour and materials for the core nations. The theory tries to explain the inequality between wealth and development across the world. In the past, relationships between the core and the periphery were purely exploitative because of colonialism, and the periphery was forced to provide for their natural resources through means of hard power, such as military force or occupation. For example, the British Empire's exploitation of India for natural resources. In more recent times, this relationship centres around the trade agreements, which are soft power, which is an example of soft power, which often benefit the core regions more than they benefit the periphery. These trade agreements often favour the core nations. Rostow's Modernization Theory. Rostow believed that countries pass through 5 stages as they grow economically and become more developed. The development can be shown in this picture. It begins with traditional society. The country's economy is predominantly based on primary industries such as agriculture, small-scale mining, foraging and fishing. There is minimal technology or scientific knowledge, which protects the country's traditional culture, religion and values. Preconditions for takeoff. There is demand for raw materials and trade by external countries. A rise in construction of infrastructure will lead to an increase in business and FDI, foreign direct investment. Gradually, the industries around the centre of manufacturing. The industries centre around manufacturing rather than agriculture. As an individual, families can earn more money from a reliable job, unlike agriculture, where it is seasonal and can be affected by extreme weather. Thirdly, takeoff. Here is the rapid industrialisation, creating a large surge of employment opportunities and productivity. Takeoff can also be a period of environmental degradation, as a nation lacks laws to protect its natural surroundings and people from exploitation. This is often fueled by relaxed laws, and regulations protecting the nation accelerates. Drive to maturity. Over a period of time, the growing economy will encourage new industries and investment, creating further jobs, improving services through increased tax. This is a positive feedback mechanism of gradually improving living conditions. And then finally and fifthly, high mass consumption. Developed countries, in Rostow's opinion, are countries who are capitalistic and consumers who hold the most valuable opinion. Often, goods are catered towards these markets, as families have a disposable income to spend. Rostow's Modernization Theory can be closely linked to the Clark-Fisher model. As a country progresses through different stages of modernisation, the composition of its economic industries will change. Criticisms of the theory. There are limitations to Rostow's model. It is based largely on American and European development of mass consumption and capitalism to create profit, and therefore ignores the stages of growth of nations who do not fit this mould, such as Bolivia's recent sustainable development. Also, some nations have large reserves of natural resources, which allows them to skip some stages of the model, such as Saudi Arabia. Rostow's model only considers the advancement of development, so doesn't describe a nation that is declining. Some examples of declining states include the USSR post-Cold War. Following the loss of the Cold War, the USSR became bankrupt and disbanded into the nations of today. Ukraine, Belarus, etc. The new Russia faced economic recession and social deprivation. Zimbabwe. For a long period of time, the government had been corrupt, limiting the country's development regardless of its level of industrial capacity. Rostow's model only considers a country in isolation from the world, where development has been the sole responsibility of the country itself. However, this is not true. In an increasingly globally connected world, the development of a country may be limited by international politics or competition for trade by other states. Superpower patterns over time. Types of polarity. A nation's power is not fixed. Many interacting factors can lead to a country gaining or losing power. In our current unipolar world is rapidly changing as emerging superpowers start to take a seat at the global table. This can lead to a change in different possible scenarios. A unipolar world is where one country dominates, such as the USA currently or the British Empire during colonial times. Secondly, a bipolar world, it says it in the name, where there are two main superpowers with opposing ideas and ideologies, such as the USA and the USSR during the Cold War period. Or there's a multipolar world, where there are several powers and emerging powers competing for power and global influence. I said power a lot there. The Colonial Era. The Colonial Era, the British Empire. Britain ruled a quarter of the world's land and a third of the world's population during its peak. The Royal Navy dominated the world's nations and was double the size of Germany's, which was the next largest. The British Empire's expansion was based on hard power. It invaded other countries and colonialised them to maintain its control. During this time, the world was considered unipolar. Colonialism had many impacts on the countries involved. The successes. Railway lines were built throughout the country and were used to transport goods and the army between places quickly. The English language spread throughout the empire, which has allowed the Commonwealth to become outsourcing services and participate in business. Education for all colonial states was improved. Schools were set up and curriculum was established. This has led to increased international migration to fill skills shortages in other countries after World War II. However, there were also negative impacts to colonial power. The majority of crops grown in colonial states were bought by the British at a very low cost and sold off by Britain for large amounts. This is called a NeoColonial theory. This means that farmers and primary manufacturers were left with little profit to invest in their own futures. Many colonial states did not have their own governments either, which caused severe protests for independence, and unstable communities and countries were made independent. Discriminating policies were established to segregate British migrants from natives. These policies have remained in some countries until very recently. In the 20th century, the empires collapsed. After the war, many colonial powers were bankrupt, as they had spent a lot during the war and so couldn't afford to maintain or control their colonies. After the wars, colonial powers focused mainly on rebuilding their home countries, and so they focused less on their colonies. Anti-colonial movements also gained popularity and increased demand for independence, which forced colonial armies out. NeoColonialism. NeoColonialism was first used to describe the dependence of former colonies on other countries after their independence. However, it has now become used to describe the exploitative relationships between more powerful countries and those who are using their relationship with less developed countries for their own benefit. Frank's dependency model contains the cycle of neocolonialism, where the neo-colony becomes dependent on the neo-colonial power controlling it. I'll put it on the screen now. Past colonialism. During the colonial era, I can't say this word. During the colonial era, there we go, empires exploited their colonies or a variety of commodities, sugar, tea, cotton, for example. The development of Lancashire, for example, was based on the cheap imports of cotton from plantations in America, where cotton would be manufactured in large mills, then through a largely mechanised process. Due to faster rates of production and it was cheaper to run. So Lancashire companies made large profits. Now we're in a period of neo-colonialism. Mozambique has given fishing rights to China in return for infrastructure such as hospitals, airports and roads. China actually has 1 million of its people living in Africa and has invested over $40 billion into African nations. This might sound quite fair, but local fishermen are now out-competed, losing their source of income. Instead are having Chinese work fishing boats, losing their source of income, but instead having to work for Chinese fishing boats for less money. The IMF and World Bank have both been accused of being neo-colonial. They provide loans to developing nations with high rates of repayment and conditions if the developing nation is unable to repay. Therefore, developing nations become trapped in a cycle of debt and have to open their economies to private companies, and governments lose their assets and income, making them even less likely to repay debts. The bipolar world during the Cold War. The Cold War lasted from 1945 to 1990 and was a time of geopolitical tension between the USA and the USSR. Both were dominant powers and were vying for more global influence and power. The USA was a democratic society that was based on a capitalist economy, whereas the USSR was under communist rule and was a centrally owned economy. During the Cold War, the USSR installed communist governments in Eastern Europe, such as in Poland and Hungary. These countries were of strategic importance to the USSR, as they provided a shield in case the West attacked Russia. The borders between Eastern and Western Europe became known as the Iron Curtain and was heavily defended by opposing parties. The countries supporting the USSR formed the Warsaw Pact, a military agreement of alliance. The USA created NATO, which its allies joined to cooperate military powers. After 1945, the USA provided billions of dollars worth of aid to many European nations to rebuild after the war years. The USA also invested significant amounts into Japan, Singapore and the Philippines in order to protect these countries from being influenced by communism. The space race became a competition of knowledge and economic capacity between the USA and the USSR, despite the fact that the USSR sent the first man and the first satellite into space. Many believe that the USA won after sending Apollo 11 to the moon. The term Cold is used to describe the war, as there was no large-scale direct fighting between the two sides. Instead, the two sides opposed wars which were described as proxy wars. The Vietnam War. The USA fought directly against groups which were supported by China and the USSR. The Korean War. Korea was divided into the south, which was supported by the US, and the north, which was supported by China and the USA. After the collapse of the USSR, the USA became the global dominating force again. Modern day and future power. Multipolar. The past shows us large, singular forces of dominating global power. However, as countries who were previously held back economically by colonialism began to develop rapidly as a new wave of nations are now vying for the seat on the main stage. These emerging economies tend to be focused on free market capitalism. This is becoming increasingly dominant throughout the world, whilst other economic systems are becoming weaker. Socialist economies are collapsed in the USSR and Eastern Europe. China has moved away from socialism and is adopting a model known as state capitalism, and there has been reform in Cuba and some limited private ownership of businesses. Currently, there is a divide into two groups of states: the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, and the G20, including the EU and countries like Turkey, Indonesia, South Korea, Saudi Arabia and Mexico. The G20 economies account for 85% of the world's GDP and 85% of the world's trade, hence are more influential. However, with changing industries and the adoption of new political approaches and ideology, the BRICS may take over the G20 and become the most influential. Emerging powers. There are many strengths and weaknesses of emerging countries' powers. An emerging country is a state that has a developing economy or government that has a large projected growth. Exam tip here: don't refer to the BRICS as one entity in your answers, refer to them individually. We'll go through this really quickly. Actually, I'm not going to go through each individual one or their political and economic differences. I'm going to leave a table linked down below that goes into Brazil, Russia, China and India. That's in the wrong order, but you know what I mean. And their economic, political, military, what's that say? Demographic, cultural and environmental strengths and weaknesses for each of them. I just think it'll be easier than me sitting here and explaining all of them. So I'll leave that linked down below. But don't refer to the BRICS as one, refer to them all individually. Tip for you: the future is uncertain. However, there is some ideas of how global superpower status could change. Stability. Countries around the world could form their own alliances and another Cold War could occur. Resources. There could be a strong economic and population growth in Asia, but along with high demand from the West, worldwide demand for food shortages could increase by 35%, 40% for water and 50% for energy by 2030. This could lead to severe shortages, high prices and conflict over resources. Military. A new arms race could occur as China expands its naval and air power. Economic. If Asia were to become dominant, then the global economy would depend on the health of NICs in Asia rather than in the West. Alternatives to superpowers, IGOs and TNCs. There are some IGOs and TNCs that have more power than one country. Often they have links to a current superpower and have economic or political influence over others. The World Bank and IMF. The World Bank and IMF provide loans between developing countries. These loans aim to help a country develop. For example, they've both been criticised due to them providing funds for projects that have been unethical and have damaged the environment, such as rainforest clearing to make way for development. They have also been criticised because they have given loans to countries who are incapable of paying back their loans. These countries, in an attempt to reduce their debt, have agreed to SAPs, forcing them to open up their markets and privatise their companies. The EU and the USA have the highest proportion of voting rights within both these organisations, so their interests are closely linked with the IGOs rather than the interests of indebted countries. The WTO, the World Trade Organization. This aims to ensure free trade and opportunity that is equal for all countries. The WTO generally aims to reduce protectionist measures. However, it has been criticised because it failed to stop developing nations from protecting their own industries. For example, the USA and the EU have given subsidies to their farmers, but this is affecting developing nations as farmers in developing nations have lost out as their produce becomes less competitive due to it being more expensive. The WEF, World Economic Forum, is a Swiss non-for-profit organisation which promotes public-private cooperation. This organisation meets every year in Davos, in which there are thousands of politicians, delegates and economists. I just can't speak today. It costs $19,000 to attend, which makes attendance for small businesses or underrepresented countries limited. Global TNCs. The largest TNCs in the world dominate from superpowers and emerging nations. TNCs come in two types. Publicly traded TNCs, who are owned by various shareholders, generally pension funds and banks, and state-owned TNCs, which are owned by governments through a 100% share or majority. In 2014, the world's 500 largest companies generated $31.2 trillion in revenue and employed over 65 million people. Many TNCs and emerging superpowers are state-owned. TNCs have become dominant and more influential than IGOs due to many reasons. Economies of scale has allowed them to reduce their costs and outcompete their smaller competitors, gaining huge profits in the process. Their ability to borrow money has allowed them to invest in new technology, and the move towards capitalism across the world has opened up more opportunities for them. TNCs have influence over global culture and the ownership of innovation and patents. Europe and America dominate the ownership of major TNCs, through which they have spread Western culture around the world. Companies such as Coca-Cola and McDonald's are recognised globally. Most of the world's global media is dominated by the USA, so their views and ideology is spread out easily across the world. American and Western culture isn't always adopted. For example, cultural dishes from Asia, such as curry and sushi, are quickly becoming more popular than American or European cuisine. Certain aspects of American culture, like American football, have been successfully adopted across the world. TNCs and governments around the world invest heavily in research and development in order to develop new products and processes that are unique. Intellectual property laws protect these new inventions through patents for technologies and systems, copyright for music, books and artwork, and trademark for designs like logos. Anyone who wants to use these innovations has to pay royalty fees to the inventor or the designer. In the past, patents have only been available to Western TNCs due to the high cost of application. However, there has been a recent increase in alternative countries with patents and intellectual properties, such as China. The UN Security Council. Arguably, the most powerful IGO in the world is the UN, consisting of 5 permanent members, the USA, the UK, France, China and Russia, and 10 non-permanent rotating members, which change every 2 years. The UN has the internationally recognised power to apply sanctions, military force and UN peacekeeping forces. It could be said that the UN Security Council works in an imperfect way, because any of the permanent members can veto a decision. The USA, France and the UK usually vote together, whilst Russia and China generally vote together, which leads to no progress within the Council. The International Court of Justice. The court, based in The Hague in the Netherlands, settles disputes between different UN member states. The ICJ has 15 judges, of which 5 are from the West, with the remaining from other parts of the world. It aims to achieve global geopolitical stability and to hold governments accountable for actions against the welfare of human rights and people. The UN Climate Change Conferences. Finally, the UN also aims to encourage the protection of the environment and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The changing attitude of many state governments has been caused by several conferences. The Montreal Protocol, finalised in 1987, which aimed to stop the use of CFS and halons, both highly damaging to the ozone layer. The Kyoto Protocol, held in 1997, which aimed to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. The Paris Agreement, held in 2015, and the COP26, held in 2021. Government alliances and cooperation. Governments may form alliances with other countries for a variety of reasons: to reduce conflict, cooperate efforts, or combine intelligence, strengthen trade partnerships, improve and protect the natural environment. Military alliances. NATO. NATO is a group of nations which was formed during the Cold War and consists of allies of the USA. Its main policy dictates that if one member gets attacked, other members will come and assist that country. Recent Russian military activity in Ukraine and Eastern Europe has brought NATO members together as they don't want Russia to gain control of more land and influence more people. This has led to the escalation of tensions, and NATO has sent more troops. Economic alliances such as the EU, ASEAN, NAFTA. These work together to increase, the EU for example, works together to increase free trade and movement of goods between people and member states. There is increasing tensions within the EU states from those who want greater integration and cooperation and those who want to leave, such as the UK. Environmental alliances. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, was established by the UN in 1988. It aims to stabilise greenhouse gas emissions and reduce the harm humans are doing to the environment. Its success can be argued, since many governments still pollute and are not held accountable by the many policies and protocols that they've signed. Global environmental concerns. Emerging economies and the growing wealth of many countries has led to increased consumption of various resources. High resource consumption, the last stage of Rostow's modernisation model, has caused many environmental quality problems. Urban air quality, imports and exports have increased CO2 emissions and so have a large carbon footprint, and deforestation, which is accelerated as people cut down trees in order to grow crops for food or biofuel. The growing middle class. In the future, the number of people who are affluent or middle class is expected to rise significantly, especially in emerging economies such as the BRICS. As a population becomes richer, they start to use more resources. The rise of the middle class will cause pressure on existing resources, such as food security, water security, energy security, and resource security. This increased pressure on resources will not only make the resources more scarce, but could increase tensions between nations who have an excess of resources on those who need them, and increase prices. Reducing emissions. The emissions of developing countries is reducing. However, emissions in developing and emerging nations is increasing significantly. This is a controversial issue. Developed economies already have gone through a period of industrialisation where they've emitted high emissions. So developing nations are in that same stage, but why shouldn't they be allowed to do the same? The reason why many developed nations' emissions have decreased is because they've outsourced their manufacturing to a less developed country who are effectively polluting on their behalf. Some critics of the EU and USA's disapproval of developing countries' emissions as a reluctance to allow them to develop. In recent years, many attitudes toward climate change have shifted. These differences in how to act could increase political tensions between countries and have long-lasting negative effects on the environment, especially as there are no sanctions for countries if they miss their emission targets. Spheres of contest. There are many spheres of contest, regions of property that governments compete over, such as land ownership. There are borders and islands that remain unclear of who owns them. This is because they have untapped energy resources, opportunity for expansion, military strategic importance. Or intellectual property. Intellectual property is difficult to protect due to increasing counterfeiting and difficult classification of a new idea. Patenting is important for TNCs, since having a unique selling point is crucial for profit. Large amounts of money are paid in legal fees each year by TNCs to try and stop other companies using their ideas. And companies with a patent don't have to share their inventions, which leads to an ethical dilemma. Medical companies don't have to release an antidote during a disease outbreak. The cost of developing new medicines and technology would not be recouped through selling if others sold the same product at lower prices. Arctic oil and gas. It estimates that 30% of the world's undiscovered gas reserves are in the Arctic, which is worth billions of dollars. As a result, sovereignty of the Arctic is disputed, as many countries claim territory within the circle, potentially allowing them to claim the Arctic itself in the future. The three main parties have nuclear weapons: the USA, Russia, and the EU. Russia placed the Russian flag at the North Pole in 2007, which escalated tension. Scientific expeditions in the area have increased, but these have seemed to be controversial. Russia and Canada have both created Arctic forces to protect their interests and run military exercises. Russia's western border. Russia considered its sphere of influence to be parts of Eastern Europe, as there are many ethnic Russians, and the majority of the people speak Russian as their first language. Many of these countries were part of the former Soviet Union. However, some now wish to join the EU, which Russia sees as a threat to its power. Tensions between Russia and the EU and America have increased, following the annexation of Crimea by Russia, and the EU and the USA imposed sanctions, which has damaged the Russian economy. NATO deployed more troops across Eastern Europe in case Russia attacked NATO member states. Developing countries, opportunities and threats. The USA and the EU have been accused of having unfair relationships with developing nations. NeoColonialism, unfair terms of trade and the brain drain are all influences of this. The economic centre of gravity. The world's economic centre of gravity has slowly shifted from the West and is travelling east. This is because Asian states are becoming influential players in the global economy, whilst the role of the EU and the USA are slowly diminishing. By 2050, it is expected that the GDP of Asia will be 174 trillion, and the USA and EU will be lower than 151 trillion. Asia's rising status. Foreign direct investment, previously flowing from the developed West, has recently originated from Asian countries such as China and India. However, some believe that FDI is encouraging neo-colonial relationships between the developing and the LEDCs, the LICs, the low-income countries. The donor country gifts money or infrastructure in return for natural resources. Asian influences on the global economy are significantly increasing. This has led to increasing tensions between Asian states as each vies for additional resources or relations to advance their global status. Conflict in the Middle East. The Middle East has been one of the most unstable regions in the last few decades. Tensions and conflict include an alliance between the West with Israel and Arab monarchies, whilst an opposing alliance has been formed between Iran, Syria, Russia and China. Whilst the Israelis are provided with billions in aid and equipment from the USA and Europe, whilst Russia backs the Iranian and Syrian regimes. The refugee crisis has been created from the conflict between different factions within Syria and Iraq, which has forced 2 million people to flee to Jordan, Turkey and Lebanon, which are struggling to cope with the large refugee numbers. This ongoing conflict between Palestine and Israel. Israel has taken land from the Palestinians and built settlements which has continued to cause tensions with Muslims around the world. Reasons for the Middle Eastern conflict is due to religion, oil and gas resources, which 65% of the world's crude oil comes from the Middle East, and the history. Colonial powers drew up the borders in this area, which caused a lot of conflict, as borders don't separate populations of separate economies and cultures. I'm going to leave another table down below for you of the uncertainty and the challenges facing the EU and the USA, the economic, demographics, political and resources and social that they're facing at the moment. So I'm going to leave that down below so that I don't have to just read it all out to you. And finally, future demonstrations of power. In the future, states may have new ways of showing their economic ability or political influence. For example, nuclear weapons. Governments currently invest in nuclear weapons to deter potential attackers. In 2016, the UK Parliament voted in favour of renewing the Trident, their nuclear weapons programme, despite it costing between £100 and £250 billion over the next 50 years. However, with changing attitudes towards nuclear deterrence, they may prove unfavourable in the future. Space exploration. Many countries now have space exploration programmes. This may prove profitable in the future, as the exploration of Mars may provide countries with natural resources and new energy sources. Money invested in space exploration is different depending on the country. And intelligence services. After recent attacks in the West, governments value their intelligence services. Also, with the rise of international incidents, for example, Russian nerve agents poisoning UKs, there needs to be espionage on other states, which may increase. And that is the end of this video. I hope you have got something from it. I hope it was useful. Subscribe down below so that you don't miss the rest. I'm going to try and get all of at least either the essential or the detailed revision things up by the May exams this year. So subscribe down below so that you don't miss them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this useful. I wish you the best of luck with your exams, and I will see you soon. Bye guys.